G'day, welcome to Bent Brewers Live, proudly brought to you by Bent Brewing Co. Here we are sitting in the little barrel room we've got here, and we're doing Barrel Season Part 3. A little bit of housekeeping, don't forget to fire in your best questions. We're giving out an awesome merch pack to the best questions, and we'll probably chuck in a little bit of beer as well for those who send through your questions. And also don't forget that these beautiful lids are disappearing. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see the beer, you won't be able to smell the beer, and you won't be able to taste the beer as well when we finally have to get rid of our 360-degree lids and move to that traditional lid. So we've done that with most beers, but Sprocket still has a beautiful little 360-degree lid. Smell those hop aromas, really taste that beer. So fortunately, we can't get those lids anymore. The manufacturer in the US is not making those lids, and New South Wales EPA has decided that our lids, Little Bent Spoke down here in Canberra, contributes way too many parts to the litter stream in New South Wales, way more than Coke bottle tops or stubby tops. So they've decided that our little lids can't exist anymore. So we'll go through the steps to try and appeal that and change that decision. We love our lids. We think it improves the beer experience no end. So stay tuned. We'll keep you updated with any information we have. I'm excited to be back in the barrel room. Probably seen barrel beer really evolve in probably the last 10 years in certainly Australia. We've all got to remember that this beer or this type of beer has been brewed for centuries around the world, and it's really humbling as a brewer to really, try and emulate some of those great beers that have been brewed for so long. And I think there's only really one person that's doing it really well in Australia. And when I mean really well, I mean gold medal standard beers coming out all the time. I'd really like to welcome Topher from Wildflower Brewing and Blending to the show tonight. Topher, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much, Rich. That's incredibly humbling coming from you. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I do really believe that though, Topher. I mean, you probably, you've certainly won a swag of medals with your beers, but I think having a brewery that's fully dedicated to mixed culture fermentation and backing yourself to be able to survive on that, I think is a credit to you and your family, and credit to the people involved in Wildflower. But also, I think very smart business decision. How did you actually get into beer?
It was a slow process, I guess. Like many people, I guess I started as a home brewer. I started through university, so I was studying astronomy and astrophysics here at Sydney Uni, and I thought that making beer at home would be a much more fiscal and frugal way of acquiring beer during my university days. My friends loved it. It wasn't any cheaper than buying beer, I can tell you that. But I've always sort of been interested and intrigued by doing things from scratch. So starting from, the raw inputs of a product, and then seeing that product sort of come to life through some sort of process. So growing up, mom never baked, with a packet of cake. It was always from everything from scratch. She grew a lot of her own vegetables. We always cooked from scratch. And I think that kind of carried on with me throughout, is this kind of desire to take things back and ask the question, why? Why does it work like that? Why does it taste like that? So once I finished my degree, I kind of had the decision to stay in research or to jump into the brewing industry. And, I guess I like having beer more than I like studying. So here I am.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess, one step further, Wildflower, how did all that start? And what, you just went over 4 years, 3 to 4 years old, was it?
3 years this past weekend was our cellar door open, but that makes it about 4 since we've really been going as a company. There's quite a lag between starting the brewery and brewing operations before actually starting to sell our beer because of the way that we make it. Just 3 years, so thank you. But that transition, I think, happened despite my bastardized accent that I speak with now. I've been in Australia only for 10 years. I grew up in Texas, in southern part of the US, and moved here at 18. And as a brewer, like when I came into the brewing industry, I always found myself leaning towards and pushing towards making a beer or a product, let's say, making something that was more representative of where that thing was made, rather than just it being made in that space and calling it local. So I continued to forge ahead, I guess, with the ideas surrounding what makes a beer local. What is the flavor of an Australian beer? You know, is a beer Australian because it's mixed up in a warehouse in somewhere in Sydney, although it's been made with entirely imported ingredients? Potentially, because the person at the helm there is living there and they're making beer for a market there. But I guess I've been always interested. I became increasingly interested in sort of more the agricultural inputs into beer, their origins, their stories, and how we could potentially, through this brewery, take uniquely Australian, at some stage would be 100% there, grown products and hops, malt, and yeast as well, or just uniquely Australian sort of raw inputs, and make something from that that's palatable. That's the entire concept, is just to take what we have and make something that's drinkable. We don't go to our beer recipe making with an idea in mind. We don't go say, okay, this is what I want this beer to taste like. I mean, sure, there's like little elements we can change in terms of bitterness or something like that, but in order to affect the end flavor profile of our beer, we really need to be looking a step back, which is at the farming. So instead, our recipes are built from the ground up, rather than the top down. We don't start at the finish and work back. We start at the bottom and say, what can we express? What's really interesting here? And work up from there. And then at the end of the day, try to say, how can we work with this yeast or this malt or these hops in order to really express them in a positive way?
And how have you found it trying to find ingredients to live this dream as well? I mean, as a brewer, you rely on really good quality ingredients to make good beer. It's also about the process and having consistency there. But at the end of the day, to make, if you want to make a good curry, you need nice fresh. The best curries might have fresh coriander as opposed to dried coriander, for instance. But how do you go about and finding your ingredients?
To be honest, it's been pretty simple for us, Rich. I've started with the idea of always using as many as possible ingredients from New South Wales. So for that really started for us with the grain and the yeast. So, when most people make beer with yeast, and I have no issues with monoculture beer, I really like it. You purchase yeast from a laboratory where it's propagated up, and then you use that in your brewery for however many generations as a monoculture yeast. Our yeast, I became infatuated with the idea that these expressive flowers, the native flowers that we have here in New South Wales or across Australia, really are kind of obsessed with Australian flora. They would exhibit something that's really unique and really high quality, like in terms of high quality in the sense that I would need to work with them to express them really positively. But I really do have this same, I guess in some ways I have this idea that, these best of lists of restaurants or wines or charcuterie, they really are kind of an obsolete idea. Really, the best charcuterie that you're ever going to eat is the pig that you grow in your in your paddock or your backyard, and you cure it and age it yourself, and then you slice from that. You can't tell me that you're going to buy something that tastes better than that because of the work that's been put into it. We wanted to kind of apply that idea into the beer. So instead of saying who by someone else's standards makes the best malt, who by someone else's standards propagates the best yeast, who by someone else's standards grows the best hops, instead we say, what can we do, as artisans? Like, it's our job as the brewers to take what we're given and express them in the best way. I don't really enjoy going to restaurants that things are flown in from around the world to put on the plate. Yeah. My restaurants are the ones that are walking down to the market, so they're going down to their local fishmonger and getting what they have and really creating some expressive, unique dishes. So I guess in some ways that was one idea, but also the time that we started sort of crossed over with a really important time in the sort of agricultural input parts of Australian beer. My hat is completely off to brewers like yourself, Rich, and those that have been in the game for a long time, because without the work that y'all would have done, and without the people that y'all would have brought into beer, there wouldn't be places like Voyager Craft Malt out in Whitton, New South Wales, or just south of Griffith, rather. Stu and his business partner Brad there, and longtime mate, started taking barley that their parents and their friends would have been contracted to grow, and initially just been sold and traded on the open market through Grain Corp, where all the grain is blended in together, and instead started buying up parcels of grain from growers, contracting a fair price at the beginning of harvest. They're not playing the stock market literally with their grain as it's growing, and instead taking that single origin malt and malting it in a local malt house there in New South Wales, instead of buying it in New South Wales and that grain being sent to any maltings across the country, which there are a number, but based on production schedules, malting it where it's grown and then sending that directly to breweries. Stu was getting started. He probably got started a year to year and a half right before we started working. So we've always been able to work with Stu. And now exclusively we work with Stu. It's just the only malt we buy. And as
Have you changed these bags? Are they still as hard to open as what they were?
No, super easy. We've upgraded the bags, new sewing machine. In fact, his bags are paper with cotton, and there's a vegetable-based liner inside of them. So they keep out the moisture, but they're entirely biodegradable. Yeah, which the plastic bags that malt generally comes in are just single-use sort of things.
Yeah, I agree. We've had to turn our bags into all sorts of things. So we've got them up on the wall in the brew pub. We've got them on seats. We've used them to make cushions out of. So we try and recycle a lot of that, especially when we have events and we need, to pad out the seats that we get in. So grain bags come in handy, but unfortunately at the moment we're using a few more grain bags than we need seats. So it'd be good to get a different grain bag there. I'm getting pretty thirsty. You want to have a taste of one of your beers? We've got the Wildflower Gold.
Yeah.
And Topher's going to take us through what this beer is all about and the flavours that we should be experiencing. I'm sure you've all had this before. Certainly one of my favourites, one of my top two from Wildflower.
Thanks, Rich. Sure, so I'll take you through it. So this beer is made in a similar way to our amber. So this is one of our sort of core beers, let's say, and without waxing too far onto it, because I do want to keep things simple. This beer is one of the two that really is a pillar of what we do. So Gold is a 5% ABV, and we call our beers Australian wild ales. Wild ales in the sense that the yeast that we use to ferment our beer, like I mentioned before, was cultured off of native flowers here in New South Wales. That yeast that we culture off of the flowers, and by culturing yeast from flower wild or your mate's property, or definitely not national parks where you're not allowed to take things from, and taking cuttings of flowers, particularly in bloom, which are being really attractive to bees. On the flowers at that time, you have a lot of nectar. There's a lot of sugar sources. That's what the bees are after. And yeast is a microfungi that requires sugar to stay alive. So generally, most places in the wild where you can find sugar, you'll also find yeast. Liken that to the natural wine movement, for instance. There's a lot of different definitions in natural wine. In a similar way, there's a lot of different definitions of craft beer. But I think across the board, people would say that a natural wine is one that's being fermented with indigenous yeast. So those that are on the skins of the grapes, and a lot of conventional wine and historic, sort of more traditional estates, whether they call themselves natural or not, would be doing that because the yeast is there on the skin of the grape. If you buy blueberries and you see that white bloom, that's just yeast. If you crush those blueberries, probably add a little bit of sugar, you could probably make blueberry wine. Might not taste any good. I'm not going to tell you the But definitely, if you were going to do that, buy some organic blueberries. Either way, we would take the cuttings of the flowers and then put them into unfermented beer, which is wort. And then the sugar in the wort would be available for the yeast that was on the flower, and the flower would consume that sugar, create ethanol, and create something and ferment, and it would make something sort of beery. So over the course of about a year, I did a huge number of captures and harvesting of different flowers, yeast from different flowers. The flower that's on this beer is a golden wattle blossom, which being a winter, well, it's really an opportunist bloomer as I understand it, but usually we start seeing it now. As I was driving through Canberra recently, and you're starting to see some wattles come up. Being a winter blossoming tree, and it seems to give some really clean fermentation characteristics. So anyway, we would take these cuttings and we collected this wild culture, and then we blended that. We did initially blend that with a Saison strain, so a Belgian origin strain. And we blended those two together, and we gave that to our wort. Wort is the substrate that then is fermented to make beer. And that's what we call our beer Australian Wild Ale. So I told you I wouldn't wax on, but here I go. Anyway, so we make a beer.
We've got people loving to hear this stuff, and I mean, I think what makes you special and Wildflower special is the thought that's gone into making this really different product. And I think this is you telling your story, and this is the story of your beer. So I've got plenty of beer here, so keep going.
Okay. So we mix up a wort, which is 60% pale malt and 40% raw wheat. We brew that at a local brewery nearby, usually over at Batch Brewing Company, which was my last port of call. I was a brewer there before leaving to come here. So we don't have a brew house here as such, and it's a different business model where I go contract time on someone else's brew house to make my own wort, and then I transfer it here sanitarily, and then do my fermentation, aging, packaging, and then aging again here. But so I'll brew that elsewhere, bring it here, and then we introduce that yeast to it. The yeast now, we introduced that culture that we took from flowers to the first fermentation that we did in December of 2016. And we're up to about 160 generations of that now. So we just collect it off the bottom of one fermentation and pitch it into the subsequent one. Collect, pitch. Very simple process. Something that could have been done 250 years ago very easily. So we bring that wort here, ferment it with our house culture, and for about 10 days it ferments in a very shallow, wide fermentation vessel to really build a lot of esterification. There's an inverse relationship between hydrostatic pressure, so how much weight of beer, the column of water, let's say, above you, and the ferment's ability to release CO2 back up into the atmosphere. And the more CO2 in the beer, the less esters you get. So you think about open fermentations in the sort of English sense, and particularly even Czech lager, open shallow fermentations, are really going to build a large ester profile. And that's something we're searching for here as well, because we generally don't spice our beer. We do add fruit to them during fruit seasons, but the main aromatic compounds of the beer I want to come from the main flavor driver, which is that yeast that we cultured off of the native flowers. So we ferment the beer in a wide, shallow vessel, and then that beer gets transferred to all of these barrels. Ooh, it's probably bad, but sorry, there's not much light in my brewery, but behind me are around 200 or so. I actually don't know. Still in Marrickville, still under the flight path. It's rare now these days. Very few planes. But that beer then gets transferred to the barrels behind me, which were sort of around the 220-ish range, I think. And the beer then ages there for any number of months to years. So to make the beer that you have in your glass rich, or the one that I have in mine now, which is the same blend of gold, we then go to that stack once a month or once every 6 weeks, say, and we'll taste every individual barrel that we have that's full of this beer, gold. And we'll blend then specific barrels from different ferments in different seasons and different ages in barrel in order to get the consistency of flavor that I'm really after in this beer. So we wanted to make a beer that was expressive of the seasons, expressive of the raw materials, expressive of the yeast that we're using. However, I didn't want anyone purchasing our beer to to have to be taking a risk on any particular bottling. It was my duty as the brewer to not only make a quality beer based on the raw materials and the best beer based on the sort of season, but also to make something that's consistently available, which is one of the things I try to do with this beer, is always have it in the market, and consistently quality. Like I don't want, for instance, our beer at a restaurant to buy in a new blend and it's totally different from the previous one.
Yeah.
So the way that we kind of manage that variation and that kind of diversity, because every fermentation throws its own characteristics, every barrel throws its own characteristics, is to blend. And this is a technique both kind of borrowed from the wine world, but also in beer we have beer de coupage, which is a blend of young and old beer, and in the in and around the Brussels area we still have an amazing beer called Gueuze, and Gueuze is a blend of lambic, which is spontaneously fermented beer. Traditionally, the Gueuze is a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old beers. So those beers, the 3-year-old beers give oak, they give acid, they give Brett. The younger beers give fresh fermentation spice, a bit of sugar for re-fermentation, and the 2-year-olds, for a spontaneous beer, for instance, are really in that prime kind of mouthfeel space. So you have to kind of take the compositions of different barrels and build them in a way which give the palate, give the beer in that way aroma, like a freshness. Like you don't want a beer to be tired and too oaky. We want it to have some kind of moreish, savory characters, which we do get from a little bit more time in barrel.
Yep, and I get that in this beer as well. I think the two things that come out for me in this beer is that sort of earthy note, that sort of moreish note that comes through, but also I think the acidity is a big contributor to the balance of the beer. And I think that's something that I see when I'm tasting, whether it's judging beers in a competition and sour beers, mixed culture beers. You see a lot of beers that are just so out of balance in terms of acidity. And I think being able to create unique flavours through mixed culture fermentation, but also then get the acidity right is the key. And I think this is what you're alluding to. I think it is the blending part is just as important as the aging part, because if you don't take the blending part seriously, then you could end up with lots of beer that's really high in acidity, or you could end up with lots of beer that's flabby and is just bursting for some of that acidity.
Definitely. No, 100%. I completely agree. And we call ourselves Wildflower Brewing and Blending because I didn't want people to not know that we're making beer. I am brewing. But the blending is critical to what we do. And I think it's one of the reasons, so our focus on this, this is let's say our core beer, and this is at best 18-month turnaround from that's the quickest it'll be. Generally, we're probably more at 24 months. So if that's your core beer, it requires so much dedication. Well, from us, it's shocking to me how much time we spend blending. But it's so important to what we do, and we honestly probably couldn't make clean in terms of how it's me and my brother-in-law own this brewery, and we have one full-time employee and a couple and one sort of intern at the moment who's stuck here from the States, but we're really happy to have him, and someone else who's part-time. So it's a small team, but we spend so much time blending, and the way that all of our heads are geared at this stage, I don't think we could actually make clean beer alongside it. It would just jumble with our heads too much. We're always thinking months and years in advance, and so if we had to make something quick, for me, quick is like a 4-week turnaround. God, that would stress me out so much. Like, how would I get in time and labels in time? And I just can't do it. So maintaining our kind of focus as being a mixed culture brewery has actually been something that I think has been a really positive thing for our brewery. However, I've had many excellent beers from mixed culture beers from breweries that make clean beer on site. They must be better schedulers than me. And
we've been doing a little bit of that, making some mixed culture beers in amongst some of our cans. So it's all about having really good quality control process, being able to separate out those processes and let different let the two different strains cohesively exist together. And I think it's one thing we do is we do use a lot of hot water like super hot water, and I think that is one thing that makes a big difference when you're trying to separate out, some bacteria from, or have sort of clean systems. I might throw to one question straight away because it's a bloody good question from Giles Hatwell. Can the panel discuss the importance of controlling oxygen? We're called a panel. That's pretty cool. Importance of controlling oxygen levels at different stages of the sour beer fermentation process.
Sure.
Topher, you want to lead out on that one? I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, when you're making wort, there's always a point where it is good for yeast health to add oxygen. So during our knocking out process, so when we're going from kettle to fermentation vessel, we are adding pure oxygen to the beer, and that's really important to get a clean, nice, healthy fermentation started, good yeast growth. That's the only time I want oxygen to touch our beer ever, and I think this is really similar to making a really hoppy beer. I mean, we're pretty particular about it around here, as if it was a hoppy beer we're making. Now, the difference is that our beer, once it's fermented, goes into oak barrels, unlike the ones that Rich is sitting behind, and in front of, rather. Oak barrels are permeable to the environment. They're not stainless steel. So there is an ingress of oxygen, slow ingress of oxygen through the staves, through the heads of the barrels. And so there's a couple things that we do to manage that ingress. Firstly, we always use fermentation bungs. So we use these special bungs on the top of the barrels that always will allow small amounts of CO2 to leach out. What could happen is when you have a hard bung in there and over a long fermentation, 8-9 months, you're still creating CO2 pressure, you could potentially blow that bung off, and maybe you wouldn't see it for a couple of days, and that would be a real issue. I've seen barrels turn from great beer to acetic beer in less than a day. And acetic is a flavor created by acetobacter. It creates acetic acid. Acetic acid is what the main driver in vinegar. So I often think, like, we're making slightly tart beer, we're not making vinegar. So I don't want oxygen.
Slight little addendum to that is that obviously the Flanders red style of beer does call out for a little bit of that in that. One of my sort of favourite styles of beer, but as Topher says, it's very it's one of those. For me, it's been one of those ones that when you get a bit of acetobacter in a barrel, you never get rid of it. Doesn't matter how hard you try and steam it or clean it or whatever. Once you get a little bit in it, it's never coming out. And you can always keep one of those barrels to once again blend a bit of that acetobacter, a bit of that that acid into your Flanders red that you're brewing.
If you want to, yeah. I mean, so for me, from a brewer, from a very purist point of view, I think it's an indication of a fermentation fault, and I don't like seeing it all in our beer. So I don't even think Flanders Red should have them. Call me BJCP and the World Beer Cup guidelines can get stuffed. I don't think. Anyway, a couple of things you can do if you're doing it at home, though. One, maintain that you have a bung, like a nice bung in there. If you can't get a fermentation bung, Rich has got a really cool method of just doing a little slice in the top of the bung where things can get out, but maybe not in. If your barrel's less than 225 liters, like a common size barrique, the ones on Richard's left, so stage right, those are the smaller ones. The big ones he's in front of are bigger, but the smaller one, if your barrel's smaller than that, you might look at maybe waxing the heads. So you might take some paraffin wax or from natural beeswax and melt that onto the sides of the barrels. That way, oxygen can't get in through those sides. There's I think below the 225 liter barrel, your surface area to volume ratio is out. So there's too little beer touching too much wood, and you're gonna have the ingress is too quick for the microbes to keep up. And that's the beauty of making mixed culture beer, is that Brettanomyces, which stays alive for months and years and hundreds of years, as we've seen, can consume that Brettanomyces can consume that oxygen and maintain a freshness in the beer without oxidizing it. So we're lucky there. The other great thing about Brettanomyces is it will create it's a symbiotic culture, but on the top there's a pellicle. winemakers call it a veil, and you get this with Apera yeast making sherry. If you've ever been to Jerez, you'll see like a big sort of fluffy, bubbly kind of layer on top. That veil, or in the beer world we call it a pellicle, helps protect any headspace from oxygen. So if you are getting ullage, so if you're losing, angel share, people know it as, but if you're losing volume in a barrel slowly over time through evaporation, and the volume of the barrel comes down, so it's not totally flat, it'll keep itself safe from that oxygen up top. You can top your barrels, but every time you top your barrel, you do break the pellicle, so you need to be considerate as to how often you do that. And
so that's why we've, you might notice, and anyone who can see, we put taps in our barrels. So, yeah. And that's one of the reasons we do that, is so that we can top up our barrels without breaking that pellicule. You can top those barrels ever so slowly. The pellicule, because the space is getting smaller, or the surface area at the top of the barrel is getting smaller, that pellicule stays intact and actually thickens slightly, and it keeps that oxygen out. The other good thing about it is that you can rack the beer out without you can rack the beer out a lot easier. Also, that pellicule does slide down the side of the barrel, and you can refloat that with the next beer that comes in. You don't want to do too many rotations, because you've got a bit of dead yeast in the bottom, which you don't want to allow it to build up, because then you're going to get all sorts of weird flavours that you don't want. But I have had some good success from refloating that pellicule and re-aging that for another 12 months. We released a beer called Motherfunker this year, and that beer has 3 years of pellicule, even though we're bringing that beer out of the barrel every year. I think we're probably going to look at collecting some of that pellicule and probably propagating it and putting it back in this year, so we can clean those barrels and get rid of all that dead yeast that's settled down, and also some protein. But you do have some success in reusing that. How do you guys go about, if you're using this, this beautiful yeast culture that you've been able to get off those wildflowers? How do you actually go about the consistency of getting that from year to year? Or do you just simply, you obviously repitch, you mentioned, but do you then just at some point repropagate from single cell, or do you literally do the flower picking and the flower, part every year?
We do it every year, but only for wattles now. So we did it last year, and come August we'll be doing it again, and then we'll add that to the culture. But really, it's like a sourdough mother. If anyone's baking at home, or you have an understanding with that, the culture is a full mixed culture inoculation. So every time we start a new fermentation, there's Saccharomyces, Brettanomyces, lactic acid bacteria, Pediococcus, and a whole host of other things that gets introduced to the fermentation, and they stay alive through that. And then we'll just collect that and repitch it, collect and repitch. It's a really simple process. It's something that I wanted to maintain a simple process instead of trying to reculture yeast from a single cell, because it's not very reproducible. Like it is in some sense, but also it's a very difficult way to run a brewery. So we just keep the culture alive. It's not banked anywhere. I don't have it stored in a lab. It's just here. It's everywhere in the brewery, and it's at the bottom of the fermentation in the tank that I'm racking out tomorrow. And I'll collect that yeast, and we'll pitch that into the beer I'm brewing on Saturday. Yeah,
great. Look, I had the opportunity to work with Canberra Innovation Network, and we actually started to look into the future a little bit and look at ingredients that, look at alternative ingredients that maybe would replace some of the ingredients like barley that maybe in the future will be very hard to actually grow. So we made a beer out of maggots, crickets. That was about 15% of the grain bill. We also went over to ANU in Canberra and got them to culture up some yeast for us out of the air in Canberra. And I was pretty to be fair, I was probably one of my most scary moments in brewing was getting this yeast that they couldn't tell me whether it had any Saccharomyces in it, and chucking it in one of our fermenters in the brew pub and making this beer. And it turned out really good. In fact, for me, it actually turned out too clean. It was sort of in some ways reminiscent of a Kolsch yeast. Do you worry that sometimes you might end up fermenting too clean and not getting that some of those characters that you want? I know that aging obviously introduces a lot of characters, but fermentation is still critical.
Rich and honesty, if I could make clean beer with native yeast, 100% I would. Brewers in the past weren't trying to make sour, funky, barrel-aged beer. They wanted to make clean, drinkable, palatable beer. And that's all I'm after as well. And if the culture and the yeast and the ferment, another plane. if the yeast that we culture from a flower or our house culture, the way that we ferment it turns out super clean, then honestly, for me, that's a positive. I guess that might be a bit surprising, I guess, coming from what we do, where people would know us as a sour beer brewery or funky beer brewery, but those aren't things that we aim for in our beers. Those are things that are byproducts of our process and our raw materials. It's our job to balance them, the funkiness, the Brett character, the oak, this acid, in a way that makes the beer still really palatable and enjoyable for a wide variety of people. I can't tell you how many times people tell me they don't drink beer and then they taste our beer and they go, "Oh, this isn't beery. It's not beer." And I'm like, "Well, it is beer." And there's flavor profiles of our beer that are shared with, Riesling, with cider, with sake. If people have other flavors and they don't like the heavy malty or the bitter or some of the other flavors. I mean, I'm sure you see this with some of the beers that y'all make as well. What beer is and what something being clean and palatable. I see the byproducts of our fermentation, acid and funkiness, as things that we can use as small little levers, but we don't want them to become overriding. Or else the beer comes out of balance, and then it's just another aggressive beer on the market, and we don't need any more of that. There's plenty of those there. So I know I'm certainly not worried about the beer becoming too clean. We had a beer that we released this year called Wattle Drops. Maybe it was late last year, and it was a beer entirely fermented by the blossoms from wattles. And it was super clean, and I loved it. And it was very saison-y, maybe a touch of acidity, but that was it. And I loved it. I think our customers did too. It's not, the story isn't about making acid for me. The pursuit is making something from what you have. So I would call that a success based on what you did.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to try it again. So we'll see how the second one goes, and I'll keep you informed how that goes, because it's certainly a fun thing to do. Is using, one of the key ingredients in beer that comes from the air that you're brewing, so to speak. So we'll fly through a few questions. Daniela loves Wildflower. It's one of her favourite breweries, but she wants to know where she can get it in Canberra. Well, I know she'll be able to get it at Plonk and those Plonk bottle shops. Page Bottler, any good craft beer bottle shop in Canberra, I think will probably stock your beer.
Yep. And Bar Rochefort, Pilot, what was Monster turned into? A number of great restaurants.
Rebel. Yeah.
If you come on Rebel, thank you. If you go onto our website, there's a beer locator, and you can punch in your postcode or your suburb, and you punch in Canberra, and it'll show you there, based on bottle shop or restaurant, who we sell to. We're not technically sound enough to have a live list of what those people have, so maybe just give them a ring. But yeah. Also, small plug, you can always buy it online on our website.
There you go. You can always buy it online, and always support local. So have a go at Wildflower's beers. Justin's, I think we've answered Justin's question. How closely do you monitor your culture, and making sure that it's all super clean? I think we've covered that one off. We might jump down to Ant, the brewman. He's got a question. How do you decide on the base style and it's 50% pale, 40% wheat? And have you considered dark mild and other styles?
I've had mixed culture dark mild, and it's awesome. It's so good. I've also unintentionally made mixed culture Czech lager, and it's also pretty cool for a while, and then it kind of drops off. But anyway, I'm getting another plane. Sorry, I'll just speak up. Is it okay? Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you. It's all right.
That's got to be a freight plane. There's not many A380s landing anymore. Really, it was a look back at classic styles that have maintained their relevance, or we have a history of them because they still exist. I'm sure there were dozens of styles of beer and farm beers that have just been completely lost, and that'll be really exciting when we kind of continue to adjust that. But when we can continue to relearn that, Gold, our two main base beers, Gold was really meant to. It's essentially a barrel aged saison, kind of blended with a little bit more, obviously a bit more raw grain in the style of lambic. Lambic as well is 60% pale, 40% or pale or some sort of pale malt, and 60%, 40% raw wheat. So we kind of just macerated with both those ideas, and then over time we've come to where we are there. The amber, I would say, is the recipe is a kind of non-traditional bière de garde. Traditional bière de garde would be quite pale in color and then boiled for a very long time to pick up the color. In fact, I have friends in France that make bière de gardes that are as golden as this beer. So the idea of what style is when it comes to those things is quite loose. And if you look at the style guidelines for both saison and bière de garde, you can see that the parameters are quite wide in terms of what's allowed if you're brewing to style, which we don't. So those
and just a note there, those parameters should be pretty wide as well, because saison's probably one of the most varied styles, and there are so many different interpretations of that style, so many different ingredients that can be used in that style, and I guess so many breweries that make that style, especially overseas and in Europe. So I think if you're comparing like a saison to an IPA, you know, they're chalk and cheese. The saison has so many different flavours and characters that are driven from the ingredients, but also driven from the yeast, whereas the IPA is all about the hops. So
should they? If you have a farm brewery that's growing rye, oats, barley, and wheat, and they put all of those things into a beer, yet at the same time they're growing Cascade hops or, let's say a New World hop on a farm brewery, and they're putting those things into their beer, fermenting with a yeast that's indigenous to their area, or maybe something that's been isolated from the area, like what my mate with Batchel at Van Diemen does, both our friends. How can you not call that saison? Like, that's
exactly
saison. Yet someone else's idea of what that needs to be is probably not as useful as the reality. Anyway, rant.
And it's a perfect rant as well. I love my rants. Everyone knows that. How do you see sour beer in Australia at the moment? Like a mixed culture beer in Australia. Like, do you feel that there's some other good players coming through, some other people that are really learning about brewing these beers slowly, or do you feel like there's a bit of a rush on?
No, I think we're incredibly lucky, and if you're a beer drinker in this country and you enjoy mixed culture beer, you've honestly got some of the cream of the crop. Before COVID, my job took me around, different places in the world, showing our beer and visiting festivals, and I have continually been disappointed by mixed culture beers that aren't made in Australia. Outside, like I'm being completely genuine. There are a handful of breweries, and there are some that I hugely respect and really love their beer that are made elsewhere. Particularly friends at Jester King. I've got a friend in Seattle with his brewery called Floodland, and I think they make excellent beer. Of course, lambic producers are doing some incredible things, but I have to say, like, when it comes to Glasseran, Future Mountain, 2 Meter Tall, Van Diemen, yourself, who else has barrel programs? I'm forgetting. All of those beers, I think we have a culture here in this country of making mixed culture beer that is, or we have a style here, let's say, of making mixed culture beer that is, for them at the primary focus, palatable and drinkable and balanced. It's not about extreme Brett. It's not about extreme oak. It's not about extreme funk, or acid, rather. It's about using those parameters that you get from mixed culture beer, oak, Brett, and acid, in a really balanced and nuanced way to make something that's really enjoyable. So I'm hand on heart think that pound for pound, this country makes some of the best mixed culture beer you can get your hands on.
Yeah, and I've certainly seen the growth in these styles of beer come through, certainly in the last 10 years. But I also go back to one thing, and that is when you look around the world at all the really good producers of mixed culture beer, they go through they go through 4 distinct seasons. And I think if we have a think about those breweries that you've mentioned, they're all in areas that do get really good seasons. And I think the seasons and the cold through the spring into summer and then back into autumn is really important for aging mixed culture beer. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or I put you on the spot there?
No, I mean, you have put me on the spot a little bit. I haven't thought about that particularly, but I mean, I know we do monitor the temperature of our barrels during summer here in Sydney. So there are drapes behind me that come down, and we kind of keep the barrels not getting too hot. Going back to the acetic acid conversation, you need heat to create acetic acid by acetic factor. But I really like letting the barrels get cold during winter. And although Sydney is a moderate coldness compared to Canberra, I like them getting cold, and I like them warming up, and I like them going through those things. I mean, at the same time, Rich, I do know of a number of breweries who are in other climates who might be more warm or moderate. They're making great beer, make great mixed culture beer, but their beer barrels are probably temperature controlled year round as well. I mean, I kind of like shooting from my hip, and I like things being exposed to the environment. I think it adds something to the beer. But yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think our climate in Australia is actually we're pretty lucky for that. I mean, probably, Newcastle, Sydney down would be a good place to do this in the ambient environment. But yeah, particularly, I mean, I think in some way, I don't know. I don't want to get too heavy. I'll stop on the head.
We've got a couple more questions from Justin. Do you prefer beer that's been aged in barrels straight from wineries and distilleries, or do you prefer to use, Cooper shaved barrels or even recharred barrels before putting beer in them?
No, we always neutral oak. So from distilleries and wineries for sure. I guess I like to use the barrel as the vessel that the beer ages in, rather than a flavor component. So I don't want our beer to be indicative of. I don't want you to taste smoke or toast or vanillins or oaky flavors. Those should really sit on the sidelines, if they're even present at all. So we always purchase or acquire from wineries what would be called neutral oak. So that oak those barrels have generally leached out their kind of more oaky flavors, if you will, into wines. You think about it as well, if you're working with wine or with spirits, the alcohol is so much higher in both of those products than it is in beer. So our base beer, this is 5% ABV. Putting young 5% ABV beer into new oak, beer after 6 to 8 months tastes like sawdust. It cannot hold itself against that. Maybe that would be really interesting as a component to a large blend, but I can't. It's not what we desire. So our preference is to work from winery, is to buy barrels from wineries that we know. My preference is to pick them up. All but about 20 barrels in this brewery, I physically go drive a trailer and go pick them up, so you can see the condition that they're in. You know the person that's giving it to you. We always buy them wet, so never a dried out barrel with sulfur rings to maintain it. So they're always kept. We buy them sort of recently after racking, or they've been maintained with a sow solution to maintain the moisture inside the barrel. And at that as well, finally, they're generally, and actually almost always, French oak, which is a tighter grain, a tighter oak than say an American or even a Hungarian, which both of those latter two might give some of those bigger, ballsier kind of oak characteristics that we just don't desire in our beer. when oak comes up in our beer, and I think the Gold Blend 25, which both of us are drinking, generally the oak component of our beer shows up a bit more spicy. It's a bit more limey. And that comes from not only the forest that it comes from a particular cooper that we use a lot in this. Well, we just happen to have a lot of, and that's an oaky character. I think pairs well with our beer better than if we said oaky. I think people know what we mean by that. That bourbon kind of vanilla draw down. I think that oak pulls away from the palate, whereas spice can kind of lift it. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. We do the same with our barrels. If they haven't got a pint of red wine in them, then we won't take that barrel. And you do get a lot of people trying to sell you barrels that literally have nothing in them. I'm pretty lucky to have a lot of wineries around us and some people with some good connections that have been able to get us some really good quality barrels. And even though we're not looking really at the oak character coming out of those barrels, we still want good quality barrels because they then also help to stop the amount of oxygen getting into the beer that you're aging as well. And the last thing you want is leaking barrels, because then you get the flies building up and you get that acetobacter. And we've been down the vinegar story a bit earlier.
Yeah.
Topher, what's been your best beer experience ever? You can take a moment to think and have a sip.
I mean,
well, maybe there's a few of them.
I'll give you two. One of them would have to be the beer that you drank the after service on the first day you open your own brewery.
I'll agree with that. Yep.
I mean, when we opened the cellar door, we had so many people coming through and just sitting down with my brother-in-law, his wife, my wife, and ourselves, opening a bottle of the beer that we just, for the first time, released. Eclipsing that is going to be tough. In terms of a beer experience, it's just really fulfilling and really humbling. Outside of that, it has to be probably would be there's a bar outside of Brussels that's open on Sunday mornings after the local church service. It's called In de Verzekering de Tegen Gotengroste. That's my best Flemish.
Done well.
Which is in defense of the great thirst. So this bar exists so that no one will go thirsty. And it's open on Sunday mornings, and it's hands down the best lambic bar in the world. You go there on a Sunday, you can catch a bus or catch an Uber at a tiny little town. And sitting there, in amongst locals, and now there's a lot of beer travelers like myself that would go there. So there's a fair bit of English going around amongst the Flemish. But being there and seeing, the old papas, people in their 70s and 80s drinking lambic, which, we came to through, an obsession with beer. That's just how it is for them. It really, for me, lays down the law in terms of this style of beer being something it's not a flash in the pan. It's not something that's a prize for the elect. It's not something that should be coveted or expensive. This is just beer, just like a clean American light lager.
Exactly.
It's a really great experience. I think for me to remember, what we do, while it is very interesting for a lot of people, it's interesting to myself, or while some people view this style of beer production as like a pinnacle or some sort of peak beer nerdery or beer geekiness, this is really a homely production style that wasn't anything special for a really, really long time. And while it's special because it exists, the people that I look to, I think what they're doing is really special. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it is something that's just meant to be really common and enjoyable and enjoyed by everyone, not by any gender or age group or, financial kind of ability. It's a beer of the plebiscite. So
it's funny. It's basically what everybody drinks in Belgium, but it's considered nearly, basically a wine in the rest of the world, or certainly in Australia. So it's really different beer cultures. Motor Lambic, also another good lambic bar there as well. One last question we've got from Josh from Capital Brewing, our friends just around the corner here, and also collectively setting the the capital of light. How do Wildflower educate the mass consumer? And whose responsibility is it? Is it ours, or is it the responsibility of the community to learn more about beer? And I want to jump in just first here and say, I honestly think it's a little bit of both. The brewers do a great job in actually getting the beer to the consumer. The consumer should do a little bit of work in learning about what they're buying, what that beer is, before they actually get it. And I think if people actually go to the trouble of doing a bit of research and learning about that beer style, I mean, when we judge at the World Beer Cup, there's ridiculous amount of different beers, probably 130 or something different categories for beer. So you don't expect everyone to always know about every single beer style and all the little bits and pieces that go together with making it. But I think if you're going to go into a bottle shop and buy a beer, whether it's in a can or a bottle, you should learn a little bit about that beer before you start ranting about it if you don't like it. Thoughts on that, Topher?
I've got another plane coming over. I might respectfully disagree with you there, Rich. I think it's our job. I think becoming a parent and being really time poor myself has made me really conscious of the fact that sometimes we just want a beer. Sometimes you just want a coffee. You don't want to be lectured to about the particular. You just want a really good coffee and a particular farm and whatever. And that's really important to some people. And I think our beer should have that story. I think our beer should have that depth if someone so inquires about it. And it's our job as brewers to have that information available, whether it be on your website, on your socials, or on the side of the can or bottle. But laboring people in order to say you must understand this in order to enjoy it is potentially is the way that I view things. Could be gatekeeping, and that's not something that I want to do with our beers. I would love, Rich, if someone goes to the bottle shop and the bottle shop owner or clerk there says, this is really interesting, you should buy it. And they go, yeah, sure. They take a punt. Know nothing about our beer. And we're particularly clean on the labels in terms of not laboring how we make our beer.
Well, we're much the same, but I think with beers that aren't probably the styles that are less popular, I think, and probably less well known, I think we can do a fair bit of education, and we always do. But I also think if people are going into a bottle shop and potentially spending a decent amount of money on a really good beer, that they should take time to understand maybe what that is, as much as, or not maybe understand it before they buy it, but maybe understand it while they're enjoying it. Yeah, that's all. Because I mean,
certainly, 100%. And if you don't enjoy it, don't hop on the internet and make all of us have a bad night because you just 2 stars, But no, I mean, I guess we're saying the same thing, but coming from a different way. We going back to the question, how do we do it? I spend a lot of time, and it is just me, trying to help people understand where my head's at and why the beer tastes the way it does and why we spend all this bloody time trying to make the beer that we make. And if you follow along or you're interested in there, I send an email, like come on a tour. And we really look at that I really look at that as a huge part of what we do. The beer market was so decimated by the conglomeration of everything and the mass kind of beigeness that it became in the 70s and 80s across Australia and America. The marketing became the exact same. The target market was the exact same. And we're still in that process. Although, we work in the bubble, Rich, we are still in that process of re-educating the rest of the market and saying beer isn't a bloke's drink that you have at a certain time on Sunday watching the footy and it tastes like this. And saying, no, like styles of beer are so broad. It's for everyone. The flavors, can be adapted, and the sort of different styles suit damn near every occasion you can have. and there is a huge variety of what we can do. So it's still our onus to reintroduce the product beer to the wider community as not as yellow fizzy drink.
Yeah, that's right. We are saying the same thing. We are coming from different angles. Topher, we've been going now for 59 minutes. It's time to probably let you get home to your family. Just want to say, really, really big thanks for coming on the show, and I generally say this, that you are one of the best modern time mixed culture producers out there, and if anyone's listening and hasn't tried one of Wildflower's beers, get on their website and order, and Topher will have to go to work pretty hard in the next couple of months, hopefully doing that. So thanks very much, and just keep doing what you're doing, and hopefully that culture is always around for you to keep doing your thing.
Thank you, and I mean, absolutely likewise, Rich. I always enjoy picking up a can because they're some of the best packaged, most consistent clean beers we can get in this country. Was so honored that you asked for me to come on to this, and I'll stop so that their eyes aren't rolling into the back of their head. But thank you very much.
No worries. Thanks everyone who's tuned in tonight. Next week we're going to dive into the dark, but honestly very sunny beer history of Canberra. We're going to bring a few people on the show that are synonymous with brewing industry in Canberra. My mentor, one of my first head brewers that I ever worked with, Richard Pass, is going to go back in time into the 80s. I don't think it was the 70s, Richard, but certainly the 80s, and talk about where brewing started in Canberra, and some of the modern time brewers that are currently going, from Zierholz and Christoph and Capital, are going to come on the show and talk about what they're doing and how they see beer in Canberra. So get ready for your questions. We'll see you all next week. Cheers.